Joining us today for our How to Classify Who is a Critical Vendor webinar. My name is Jessie Redmond and I will be your host. On your screen you should see multiple widgets that you can use, including Ask Questions, Media Player, Slides, Related Content, Speaker Bio, Request Demo, and Help. If you're not familiar with our webinars, all the widget boxes are resizable and movable, so feel free to move them around to maximize your screen space. At the bottom of your screen in the toolbar are icon buttons you can use to show and hide the widget. You can expand your slide area or maximize it to full screen by clicking on the arrows in the top right corner of the widget. If you experience any issues or have technical questions, you can use the Help widget or submit them along with any other questions through the Ask Question widget. Don't worry, we do capture all questions throughout each session. We will be answering some during the webcast, but those that we do not have a chance to answer live, we will address with you via email. Today's live session is eligible for 1 CPE credit. If you wish to receive this credit, please remember to answer all of the polling questions that will appear on your screen during today's presentation. You will also be sent a follow-up survey link 24 hours after the live session that will need to be completed in order to receive the CPE credit. With us today, we have Hillary Dewhurst, VendMinder's Head of Third-Party Risk Education and Advocacy. She will address the criteria for identifying your critical vendors, as well as how to manage them once they have been identified. You'll see a link to a copy of today's slide deck, a link to our website, a link to our samples library, links to the process of inherent to residual vendor risk infographic, our Identifying Critical Vendors 6 Foolproof Questions infographic, our vendor due diligence checklist, as well as a link to our library of additional resources, all within the Related Content widget. With all that being said, I'd like to hand it over to Hillary. Hillary, the floor is yours.
Welcome, everyone. So our webinar today is all about critical vendors, how to define them, why they're so important. We're going to talk a little bit about risk versus impact, which is a really essential element to understand when we are talking about critical vendors. And we're going to go into some questions that we can ask to help us determine which of those vendors will qualify as critical. And then we'll walk into how to manage these critical vendors because they're really important, so they need specific management. And then we'll wrap up with some key takeaways. So let's go ahead and get started. When it comes to identifying your critical vendors, this is going to be one of the most challenging things that any third-party risk management program goes through. First of all, because you have to identify the standards and criteria that will make a vendor qualified to be considered as critical, right? And to do this, we need to make sure that that criteria, once it's understood, is not only agreed upon across the enterprise, right? And it's known across the enterprise, but that it's also memorialized in your actual policy. Now, one thing that's also very important, and you'll hear me say a lot, is consistency is key. And that means that the criteria should apply to all vendors, regardless of what product or service they provide, right? Because when we use standardized and objective criteria, it removes all that guesswork and room for interpretation. So it kind of gets everybody on the same page. Well, if you're new to the idea of critical vendors, it feels like we should just talk about why we need to identify critical vendors. And the first thing I'm going to tell you is that your board and your senior management need to be aware of who those critical vendors are for a lot of reasons. But one of them is because your critical vendors are often going to be the first ones in scope for any audit or regulatory exam. And your organization should consider and include them as part of your own business continuity and disaster recovery planning, and consider them in your organizational business impact analysis. Critical vendors also require the highest level of due diligence. You know, we leave no stone unturned. And our contracts, as we write them with critical vendors, really have to be well considered and well written so that we can protect the organization and our customers. And then finally, every critical vendor should have a good exit strategy and termination plan as part of having that critical vendor, because if we need to take them out for some reason, it is going to impact our organization pretty significantly. So, of course, what is a critical vendor? So by definition, a critical vendor is one that performs a significant business function or shared service. And this is usually at the enterprise level, not the business line level. And if this product or service type fails, it's going to create material impacts either for your organization or for your customers. Now, you can easily think like, oh, what if our operations shut down? But critical vendors can have other impacts, such as the ability to satisfy your existing customers or acquire new ones. They can interrupt your revenue streams. If it's severe enough, maybe your regulators give you a big fine or you end up with some litigation. You could get a regulatory consent order that says, hey, you have to stop operating until you fix this problem. You know, it could be also that there's not a good substitute vendor in the marketplace, or it would take you a very long time to acquire one. And even in some cases, critical vendors, their interruption could cause harm to your employees or damage your facilities. We're going to talk about this more than once today, but if you hear anything, hear this. Critical is not a risk rating. Now, I know there's a bunch of you out there going, wait a minute, we have low, moderate, high, and critical. Those are our risk ratings. But critical should not be used as a risk rating, and let me explain why. Because critical is a label or a classification that helps you identify that subset of vendors within your portfolio that are going to have the most material impact on your organization or your customers if they fail, right? Risk ratings, on the other hand, help us understand all the types and amounts of risk that exist in that vendor engagement, right? So criticality is about impact, and risk ratings are about all the risks, types, and amounts within the vendor engagement. Now, we usually think about risk and criticality during the inherent risk assessment, right? And these two data points, both your risk rating and whether or not that vendor is critical, they're going to drive everything that we do with that vendor moving forward. They're going to determine the level and the rigor of due diligence. They're going to help us understand which terms and conditions we have to put in the contract. They're going to help us understand the requirements and the frequency of things like ongoing monitoring, both for risk monitoring and performance monitoring. And they're going to give us the necessary data so that we can understand just how much work, effort, and supervision it's going to take to manage this vendor relationship. Now, if you're in a regulated industry, there are plenty of regulations. The guidance says that you have to do some risk assessment and identify those critical vendors. You know, most recently, the Interagency Guidance on Third-Party Relationships came out just earlier in June. There's all these standards like NIST, ISO, HITRUST that also require it. So it is a regulatory requirement, but it's also a best practice. While this session is addressing critical vendors, I do want to talk about risk ratings and levels of risk for just a moment. So first and foremost, you have to have a solid tiering mechanism in place. Most organizations are using high, moderate, or low. Now, if you are in a financial services category, for example, or you service those organizations, and maybe you have a category called no risk or something similar, you really need to reevaluate that. And the reason why is because the most recent guidance that just came out means that all third parties are in scope, which means that having no risk vendors is no longer acceptable. Well, what if you have more risk levels, such as moderate and moderate high? Well, that's fine, but you need to consider what the difference is between them. Are you gathering different documentation? Are you applying different due diligence standards? The reason I ask this question is to help you consider what added value those additional risk levels actually add to the program. So in my experience, having too many levels of risk can really confuse the issue. It's going to require additional reporting dimensions and can end up adding a lot of extra work to your plate. Your risk rating methodology should always be objective, meaning it's based on fact, not opinion or someone's best judgment. And it should be objective to the point where all users of the methodology will produce the same risk rating. So this is best achieved by using standard questions and ranges. And when you do this, then the process can be automated. Okay, so I'm going to say this one more time because it's really important. Critical is a classification or a label. It's not a risk rating. And a lot of people tend to use these interchangeably, but in truth, they are very different, right? Risk ratings are based on the risk inherent in the activity, and criticality is the level of impact of that product or service on your organization. Every vendor should have both a risk rating and a critical or non-critical designation. And with that, I think we're ready for our first poll.
And this brings us to the first poll question of the day. You should see the poll question now in the slides area. If you have any issues, please feel free to send us a message using the Ask Question widget, and we'll be happy to assist. As a reminder, if you wish to receive the CPE credit for today's session, you must answer all poll questions and be in attendance for the entire live session. This poll question is, does your third-party risk management policy clearly define the criteria for critical third parties? Yes, no, or not sure? Hillary, we have some time now to answer one of the questions that has come in so far from the audience.
All right.
Great. That question is critical the same as operationally significant?
It's really kind of a matter of semantics. I know in some regulatory letters and things of the past, they do use the term operationally significant, but for me, personally, I feel like operationally significant means it's important, it's something we should pay attention to, but critical are more of those do or die kind of vendors, like we cannot operate without them, or the impact of their in-operation will be so dire that our business or our customers will really suffer. So, you and your organization can use your best judgment, but for me, I feel like it's always important to stay consistent with regulatory guidelines and best practice and really reserve critical for those that will, impact your business in a major way, possibly even close you down for the day or two while they're out of service. So I hope that helps.
Thanks, everyone, for answering that poll question. Here are those results. By the way, you may have noticed reactions such as a thumbs up or heart coming across the screen. If you find this feature distracting, you can turn it off by clicking the 4 arrows in the top right-hand corner of the slides widget, which will expand the slides to full screen and no longer show the reactions. Before we move on, in the related content widget, you'll find a helpful resource to reference. It's The Process of Inherent to Residual Vendor Risk infographic. In addition to criticality, you'll also have a vendor risk rating. This infographic shows the visual process of getting from inherent vendor risk to residual vendor risk. With that, Hillary, back to you.
So let's continue with this concept of criticality and getting down to the business of establishing who is critical. So I like to use an analogy of a car. Everybody's been in a car at some point. And let's imagine that you have this vehicle and you need to drive it 10 miles down the road. Now, when you stop and think about it, there are a lot of components and systems in a car, but which ones are critical to driving down the road for 10 miles? When you start thinking in this way, you could say, well, I need the engine, I need wheels, I need fuel and fuel systems, I need a way to go, I need the accelerator, and I need a way to stop, I need the brakes. But what about all that other stuff? Now, I'm certainly not advocating for driving your car without headlights or mirrors, but do you have to have them? Are they critical for driving down the road? Now, even though it might be uncomfortable and possibly a little hazardous to operate a vehicle with no headlights, for example, or windshield or seat, the truth is you could get the car 10 miles down the road without those things, if necessary. Of course, it's preferable to have all those items in good working order, but it's not critical. Now, think about your vendors that way. All of your vendors serve a specific purpose, some of which are far more important than others. Your headlights, for example, are a safety feature, while air conditioning and a radio are comfort features. We want all of our vendors to be in good working order and to deliver the optimal level of products and services to us and our customers. But when we get down to it, which are the vendors that are going to prevent our ability to do business as usual or business at all? So it's a critical vendor when it could cause the organization significant risk if the vendor fails to meet expectations. And fails to meet expectations can cover everything from an outage to poor delivery of products and services. And if you want to know why, think about your vendors that might directly interact with your customers, say a call center, for example. Sure, they might be operational, but if they have really bad customer service agents, those poorly performing agents might affect your customer satisfaction, which impacts revenue, but they also might be violating regulations, which could result in big issues for your organizations. Or what about situations where you've integrated the vendor into your processes or work streams, or the vendor provides a customized user interface that involves a complex back-end integration of multiple systems and processes? No doubt there's a lot of expense and time that went into that design configuration, the testing and implementation. And if they fail, all that time and money are lost, and it's going to be hard to recreate. Maybe you have a vendor providing a very complex service unique to your organization and they go bankrupt. Your organization would then need to scramble to find another vendor to provide the service or perform the service itself because there are no other qualified vendors. So to simplify this, we usually say there's 3 questions you can ask to help you determine who's critical. The first one is, would a sudden loss of the third party cause a significant disruption to our business? Now, before you ask me to define what is significant, we can't do that because that is unique to your organization. So the second one would be, would the sudden loss impact our customers? Now, when we think about impacting our customers, you have to think about both the short-term and the long-term impacts. If your customer has, say, autopay set up, but that system doesn't work, that could be both a short-term problem when they can't pay the bill and a long-term problem if it gets put on their credit report. And then the third one is if the service is disrupted, would there be a negative impact on your operations if the time to restore that service took more than 24 hours? If the answer is yes to any of those questions, you've got a critical vendor. Now, those are the 3 basic questions, but depending on your organization, you might need to consider other factors. For example, if you're in a regulated industry, that you're always looking at those vendors that help you support your regulatory compliance. So here are some additional things to consider. Did you have to put significant financial investments, resources, and time to implement that relationship, right? Again, if it fails, you may not have the money to repeat that or the time. Would there be a material impact to the organization or to your resources if you had to go out and get another vendor or try and bring that in-house? That could be a critical vendor. If that third-party failure happens, could that really negatively impact your reputation or your brand? Or could that third-party vendor failure attract additional regulatory scrutiny, which means enforcement actions and fines? Those are some other questions and considerations when determining critical vendors. So what are those products and services that keep your business going that you cannot function without? Well, here's some quick examples. We have payment systems, data centers, call centers, and even the post office. And, funny, we've added the post office here because it's often seen as very low risk. But let's assume that you're a financial services company with regulatory requirement to deliver that paper card statement, for the people who haven't elected for a digital copy, and you have to provide one every 28 days. If the post office goes down, you could possibly use FedEx or UPS, but the process would be excruciating and the cost would be astronomical. So in that case, the post office would be a critical vendor. But it isn't always about business availability, right? If a vendor directly accesses your customers, let's say, again, a customer call center, if those agents provide false or misleading information, you could have some very big regulatory issues. So those are just some quick examples of some vendor types that might be critical. So what about different industries? Let's look at a few examples for different industries. So for financial services, we have those core processing systems, data centers, anything else with compliant management, security and safety, and records management are all critical vendors. In healthcare, again, your electronic health records, your medication management, backup power generation, safety, that could be personal protective equipment, sterilization, infection management, even telehealth and telemedicine can be critical. In retail, your payment systems, your inventory systems, automotive. So you have your OEM or your equipment manufacturers and your VIN and serial number management systems. Other types of manufacturing, core suppliers and your supply chain management system. And even in higher ed, we have something called ERP, which is your enterprise resource planning, which does everything from lesson planning to paying the teachers, and your intranet or your network, which your students use and your teachers use every day. So we're going to come back to this concept one more time, which is don't confuse critical with high risk, because critical talks about the impact of the organization, while your risk rating talks about the types and amounts of risk present in the product and service and therefore the engagement. One thing to remember is that an overwhelming majority of your vendors that are critical are also going to be high risk. And that's true because many of the factors that make them high risk are also things that would contribute to them being critical, such as a high business continuity dependency or strong regulatory compliance or interaction with your customers. Remember, almost all of your critical vendors are going to be high risk, but not all of your high risk vendors are critical. Another really important detail that we need to talk about, especially with critical vendors, is if they're an SPOF, which means a single point of failure. And this does happen. And this means that there's no redundancy, which could mean there's not an alternative in the market, like they're the only provider. But it could also mean that implementing or retaining an alternative just isn't feasible due to finances or other resources. So a good example might be, let's say that you've integrated one of the big three data agencies into all your back-end networks and systems. It's taken months and months and months. You had a big budget carve out for this year. It's taken almost all your engineering team to do it. If that vendor fails, it's going to be really hard, or it's nearly impossible to recreate all of that in a short amount of time. You may not have the money or the resources. So that would be a single point of failure, for example. When you do have these type of vendors, it's really important to officially document them, provide that information to senior management and the board so that they can process a formal risk acceptance, which means that they know it is a single point of failure and they've chosen to accept the risk. Now, in some cases, it may be, it is what it is. But in other cases, the risk may be a little too high. It may be outside of your organization's risk appetite. So the board and senior management starts taking action to create that redundancy. Now, here's some of these challenges with critical criteria and risk ratings. And the very first one is that everyone thinks their vendor is critical. And you know, in truth, that vendor may be critical to that line of business or to that project, but it is not critical to the enterprise, to the organization. So that is a big point of contention in many instances, is everyone thinks their vendor is critical. The other big issue is that people are using their best judgment to determine criticality versus fixed criteria, right? There's no consistency of standard. So we end up possibly missing vendors that are critical or mislabeling vendors that are not. You know, another big issue is that risk ratings are not properly calibrated. So, for example, we're seeing a lot of vendors that are listed as low risk but also critical. That should be a red flag to go back and look at both your criteria for critical and what's going on with your methodology for risk rating. Another one is you just have too many levels of risk and there's no real benefit. So, you know, we have that high, moderate, low, moderate. There's just not any benefit for the program and it's creating additional confusion. And when we're trying to label who's critical or not, it could be muddying the waters. Another one is that your vendor owners just may not understand the very high profile and urgent nature of managing those critical vendor risk relationships, right? So they just treat it like anything else. Oh, no big deal. Maybe I'm a little bit late. That can be a huge problem because we need the best and most attention paid to these critical vendors. So how do we manage these critical vendors? Well, let's think about it in terms of the life cycle and what we need to do at each stage. So when we're planning for that relationship, we need a vendor owner who has the necessary qualifications and skills, right? If we know this is going to be a critical vendor, the individual who's never been a vendor manager before, who knows nothing about third-party risk management, may not be the best choice. So we have to have a qualified person to manage the relationship. We also need to determine if that vendor is going to be a single point of failure. And right from the beginning, we need to identify and document our exit strategy and our plan. So what are we going to do if this vendor fails? Are we going to get another vendor? Are we going to bring it in-house? You know, are we going to just stop doing the activity altogether? And we should start during the planning stage creating a working plan of how to unwind that relationship if we need to. We also, during the planning stage, should be identifying the service level agreements and other essential performance metrics for that relationship. Now, during the risk assessment and due diligence stage, of course, we need our inherent risk assessment, but we're going to need very thorough due diligence. And we're going to need to remediate issues when they pop up. A lot of times with our critical issues, we want those fixed before we ever sign the contract. If they are a deal breaker, we cannot execute that contract before those issues are remediated. Now, in some cases, something's acceptable, but please make sure it makes it in the contract so that that issue remediation is obligated and is time-bound. And make sure to keep a good record of all your due diligence documents that have an expiration date. So, for example, a SOC report is only good for 1 year of issue. If it expires in the middle of the year and you're not due for another big risk review for 6 months, you have a problem. You're going to want to go back and get the refreshed one as soon as possible. Insurance documents are the same. With contracts, we want to make sure that the contract has all the essential provisions, and we want to make sure that things like, you know, information security, data protection, privacy, and a right to audit are all in that contract. And we want to schedule a contract review at midway through the contract point. So the contract's good for 3 years. We're going to do that at the 16-month mark. All right, so when it comes to establishing monitoring routines, this is very important. Consistency is key, and we know that we need to do a periodic risk reassessment and due diligence at least once a year. Now, you can do it more frequently if there's been any performance issues or something like a data breach. Go ahead and do it as often as you need to. We want to make sure we're doing performance monitoring and review at least quarterly. And the reason for this is even if there is a performance issue that's just slightly, below where it should be or approaching the upper threshold of where it's not acceptable, we want to fix that right away. We don't want it to go in the ditch before we take action. We also need to think about how we're going to monitor these vendors. So we can do risk alert and monitoring services, negative news alerts, read industry journals, etc. And we want to have an annual review of that exit strategy and plan. So we want to make sure that, say, that backup supplier that we picked last year, that they're still in business, that they would be still willing and able to service our organization, etc. Now, most importantly, we need to keep management and the board informed because they are supposed to know which of the vendors are critical and what product and service they provide. They should know who the vendor owner is and if there's any issues that are open for remediation, because if they're maybe not moving as quickly, they can help apply some pressure to get it done. We also need to inform the board of any of those critical vendors that are single point of failure and formalize a risk acceptance, and follow your organization's rules for that. They do vary, so just pay attention to how it's done at your place. Critical vendor issues should always be reported to the management and the board regularly. If it's something really urgent, an email to go up the chain is fine, but things that are ongoing or in progress should be in that monthly board reporting package. And then we do want to have an annual report on all of the critical vendors at least once a year for the board, and that can be wrapped in as part of your annual third-party risk management report, which we usually recommend you do during the policy review.
Our second poll question of the day is, does your vendor inventory include single point of failure vendors? Yes, no, or not sure. Hillary, I have another question here that I think we could go ahead and answer.
Great.
How many critical vendors should you have?
There is no correct answer for that. Basically, your critical vendors are your critical vendors. If you have 10, that's fine. If you have 25, that's fine. Whatever the number is, a good rule of thumb is that generally speaking, your critical vendor population should not be really more than 15% of your total vendor inventory. Now, that's just a guideline. It could be more or less. But the reason we throw that out there is because if you have more than that, it means one of a few things. One, the criteria for critical maybe needs to be refined because everybody can't be critical. Or two, there may be some folks that are classifying something as critical, but maybe it's only critical for their line of business versus the entire organization. So don't get hung up on the number or even the percentage. Just make sure that your criteria is very clear and that it's applied consistently throughout the organization, and then you will have the right number of critical vendors identified. I hope that helps.
Great, thanks, Hillary. We have about 15 seconds left on this open poll question, so please go ahead and submit your responses as quickly as possible. Thank you. Okay, here are those results. Thanks again, everyone, for taking the time to answer the poll. I'd like to quickly direct your attention to the related content widget, where you will find our Identifying Critical Vendors 6 Foolproof Questions infographic. This resource provides questions you can ask to determine if a vendor is critical or not critical. Okay, Hillary, let's continue with the presentation.
So when it comes to monitoring these critical vendors, this is really important because we do want to know what's going on with them at all times. And one of the things that we should always be doing is that really deep due diligence. Of course, the due diligence that needs to be performed is always risk-based, right, and is based on your organization's policy. But for a critical vendor, you might need to do additional actions. So, for example, you may determine that you need to do an on-site visit, right, or that they have appropriate insurance to cover any material impacts caused by disruption or breach of customer data. This is also called cyber insurance. For a critical vendor, you may require that the cyber insurance level is much higher than, say, for a moderate or a high-risk vendor. And no, I cannot tell you what those levels are because I am not a licensed insurance agent, but the organization from which your organization buys insurance can help advise you. We also want to make sure that we're reviewing fourth parties. You need to know your critical vendors' critical fourth parties, right? Who is contributing to delivering that product or service to your organization? What do they do? Do they have access to any NPI? This is all very important stuff to know. I also really want to emphasize the exit strategy because we're talking about critical vendors. You just can't afford to be reactive. There may be very long lead times. You might need to get additional budget dollars or resources to switch to a different vendor. And the impacts will be mounting as you make your move, so you cannot delay. We always want to investigate those vendors' BCP plans. We want to know how recently they've been updated, have they been tested, when were they tested, what were the results. And we want to use that contract to secure legal protections and service level agreements. If your contract's not in good shape, identify a plan to get it there, which includes leaving a lot of time for renegotiation or to find a suitable replacement vendor. And because time is always of the essence when it comes to monitoring your critical vendors, really consider using some of these risk alert and monitoring services that can alert you with very relevant information as you need it. Don't wait for the news story to come out before you do something. So I just want to wrap up this section with some key takeaways, which is, of course, critical vendors are those suppliers that if they fail, they're going to have a significant impact on your organization or your customers. And we need to perform very thorough due diligence, meticulous contract drafting, and very diligent monitoring, right? This is crucial for our critical vendors. Don't forget that those critical vendors are almost always going to be in scope for audits and regulatory exams, so they should be in good shape. All their documentation should be organized. All issues should be tracked and managed. Management and the board should always be informed about critical vendor activities, contract renewals, single point of failure status, and any issues that come up with a critical vendor. We need to do those periodic risk reassessments and due diligence at least on an annual basis, and we need to look at their performance quarterly. Don't forget to review that exit strategy and plan for those critical vendors every year and update it when necessary. Now, I think we're ready for the last poll of the day. Jessie?
This poll question is, what is the greatest challenge your organization faces in dealing with critical vendors? Defining critical, agreeing on which vendors are critical, having skilled vendor owners to manage critical vendors that are also SPOS, two or more of the above, none of the above, or you're not sure. Hillary, let's go ahead and answer another question from the audience.
All right.
And this question is, why do you need to reassess the risk of a critical vendor if you already know they are critical?
That's a very good question, but it is important to understand that the risk of any vendor relationship can and usually does shift a little bit during that time frame. And what we found out about a vendor during that point in time, initial due diligence, can change. And that could be maybe the vendor's taken on more work, maybe there's more internal dependencies, maybe there's less competition in the market, so now that vendor's become a single point of failure when they weren't before. Or maybe there's less dependency, maybe you've added more vendors, and so that vendor is no longer critical. And it's not just about our critical vendors, it's just a good practice and a requirement from a regulatory perspective to periodically go in, look at that risk, and just to see if anything has changed. Are there new and evolving risks? Have any risks declined? So even if we know they're critical, we still have to take a look at them every once in a while just to make sure that we're all on the same page. I hope that answers the question.
Here are those results. Thank you, everyone, for answering this question. It's always interesting to see what everyone says. I'd like to direct your attention back to the related content widget, where you will find our vendor due diligence checklist. This checklist lists out items you should consider when performing your vendor due diligence. Hillary, I'll pass it back to you.
Now, we know everyone likes examples, and as we've done this similar webinar in the past, we like to walk through a vendor list. So if you want to just take a quick minute, pull up your vendor list. We're going to walk through different types of vendors and really the rationale why they may be critical or not. So let's jump into that. All right, let's begin with something really obvious. Sum total systems. There are core processors. So core processors, typically for financial institutions, they're basically that massive ledger that tracks all the money going in and out, and helps everyone get paid. This is instrumental to the business. We cannot really operate if our core processor goes down. So we have a lot of operational reliance on them. So yes, they would be critical. Then we have data king. Okay, data king in this example is that infrastructure for backup services and data access. So yes, they're our backup. So if our primary goes down, we need them to be operating. We have high operational reliance on them. So yes, they would be critical. Now let's talk about DS documents. They're a statement production facility. Now, like I mentioned earlier, there are a lot of people who choose not to get their statements delivered electronically, which means that they are entitled to get that paper statement. A lot of times that's within 28 days in the financial services industry. And whether they're critical or not would depend on a few things. One, if they're your only statement facility, right? If you only have one company doing this, only one facility who does all the statements, then yep, they're going to be critical. Because if they go down and you only have 28 days, it's going to be pretty hard to get another company up and running, get them all the data, get all the tests done, and get all that mail printed and delivered in those 28 days. But maybe you're using more than one, which is very common, then they probably are not critical. Now let's talk about Equifax, which in this case is a credit reporting agency like a TransUnion or an Equifax. Again, this could be or could not be depending on a few components. One, is it the only one that you're using? So maybe like the example that we cited earlier in the presentation, you've selected one credit agency, you've integrated them into all your systems, you're using them to make credit decisions. If you had to pull them and replace them, it's going to take a long time and a lot of effort. Yeah, they're absolutely going to be critical. But maybe you're looking at a combination of all three credit agencies before making a decision for your customer. And in that case, no, they're not going to be critical because you do have that built-in redundancy. Now let's talk about Anywhere Shred. This is our shredding service. These are the folks that come and pick up the blue bins and shred everything, or maybe they're doing, electronic media destruction. Chances are they're not critical, but there are very strong regulatory considerations here. If they fail, there could be some pretty big impacts. If some of the statements go flying out of the bin before they're shredded, or that information falls into the wrong hands, then there could be some regulatory compliance issues. Generally speaking, your shredding service is not going to be critical, but again, it depends on your organization, how much they're doing for you, and what kind of data they have access to. Okay, that brings us to Joe's Flowers. They're a landscaper, definitely not critical. It's not a crisis if the grass gets a little too long or the shrubs are overgrown. Doesn't look great, but they can easily be replaced, so definitely not a critical vendor. And that brings us to My Building. They're the landlord. Now, in the past, we've always said, no, landlords aren't really going to be critical. But, as we think through this and the different industries that we encounter, there are absolutely situations where your landlord might be critical. For example, if you're working in an industry that requires, say, very high security, and your landlord is responsible for that, they could be critical. If they are doing something like clean rooms or critical life and safety systems, and the landlord is responsible for that, then yes, they would be critical. If they're responsible for an internal data center, they have that network room, they're responsible for the maintenance and the security around that, then yes, they could be considered critical. So this is one of those examples where you really have to just take a deeper dive and look at what they're doing. In most cases, our landlords are probably not going to be critical, but if they're doing these specialized services, definitely want to take a deeper look, think about those impacts, because they may in fact be critical vendors. Now let's talk about off-site document storage. Generally, no. Now, even though off-site document storage is very important, lots of legal requirements about how long to retain physical documents, etc. There are multiple options in the marketplace, and in fact, you could move your records from one vendor to another. Generally speaking, they're not in any inherent danger, so no. Your document storage, even though it's very important, is not generally going to be a critical vendor. All right, so that brings us to Cumulus, our cloud provider. First of all, there are a lot of different cloud services that we use. There's different use cases. In most of the cases, your cloud provider is going to be a critical vendor, not only because there's a large operational reliance there, but because there are huge data security concerns. They're ripe for cybersecurity attacks, ransomware, all of that kind of stuff. So we want to make sure that we're treating them with the utmost attention and importance. So yes, your cloud provider would be a critical vendor. Now with that, we're going to wrap up, and I'm going to turn it back over to Jessie so we can have some Q&A.
Great. Thanks so much, Hillary. Before we dive into more questions and answers, I'd like to thank everyone for attending. I'd also like to thank Hillary for her time and sharing some very important information. On your screen now, you will see our upcoming webinars. On July 25th, our Vendor Exit Strategies and Plans, Managing the Offboarding Process Safely and Effectively webinar. And on July 27th, our Assessing Vendor Risk, a Deeper Dive webinar. We hope you'll be able to join us for those sessions. A link to register for those is in your copy of today's presentation slides. Let's now go ahead and answer some more questions that have come in during this session. Okay, Hillary, the next question is, what kind of experience does a vendor relationship manager need to manage a critical vendor?
Well, the first experience or skill they need is they need to really understand the product and service that vendor is providing, right? So that should be the number one qualification. Generally, I like to say that they should have a few years sort of managing that more than a few minutes. They also should have a good working knowledge of third-party risk management, understand the life cycle. You definitely want somebody who is accustomed to, identifying risk, but also managing it. So somebody who has experience if there's a vendor performance issue, working through remediation plans, being able to hold people accountable, is comfortable taking on that authority and autonomy to get it done. Generally, we see this with people who've either been working with that type of vendor for many years or are a very seasoned vendor owner or third-party risk manager.
Great. Our next question. Does the board of directors have to approve critical third parties?
Technically, I do not think that they do. They should be aware of all of them. Now, in the new interagency guidance, and you'll have to forgive me, I don't have it committed to memory yet, there is definitely usually a phrase, something that if the board's not doing it, a committee of the board should be approving that. So that should be senior management that's reporting directly up to the board, should be reviewing and approving those contracts, because after all, your board and your management are responsible, and when it comes to critical vendors, they're on the hook. So while I'm not 100% sure that there is a documented requirement that the board does it, I do know that at least a committee of the board should approve those vendors.
Great. Next question. Who gets the final say on if a vendor is critical or not, the business or vendor management?
Well, the final say should really be the criteria. So like we mentioned, we have the 3 basic questions and then a few more considerations. And if everybody says, yep, this is the criteria, they have to meet this criteria to be considered critical, there are going to be times when the business will push back. This is critical for us. And with third-party risk management, there are times when you have to be flexible, but generally I'm going to err on the side of third-party risk management. They've defined the criteria. It's in the policy. If the product or service doesn't match that criteria, then generally no, it should be considered critical, but there's not to say that there could be exceptions that you need to talk about, but I would generally defer to third-party risk management.
Great. Next question. If a vendor provides multiple products or services, how should we classify the vendor criticality when not all the products or services are impactful or high risk?
Yeah, that's a great question because it happens. So generally, and this isn't just about critical vendors, but vendors in general, when you have a vendor that's providing multiple products and services, you always default the overall vendor risk rating to the highest risk of the engagement. So they are, high on 2 engagements, moderate on 1, low on another. They're a high risk vendor. But if any of those engagements are considered critical, they're a critical vendor, no matter what else they provide. So the default always to that highest level, even 1 critical engagement means that's a critical vendor.
Perfect. Next question. Do you recommend using the business impact analysis to identify critical vendors?
I don't necessarily recommend using it in lieu of questions that are asked during that planning stage for onboarding a vendor. And the reason is that you're business impact analysis, that's generally something that your internal business continuity and disaster recovery team is working on. That may be something that they do quarterly or biannually. We need to identify those critical vendors right away, right as we're onboarding them. So I do not recommend using that instead of, but what I do recommend is when you do have a new critical vendor, making sure that your internal BCDR team has some visibility to it, because they may want to come back and do some additional analysis. I hope that made sense.
That's great. Thanks, Hillary. Next question. How do we address vendors that may not be considered to our entire organization, but are critical to a portion of our organization?
Yeah, so this goes back to, it's a line of business, right? It's a certain product or service. And then generally, when we talk about critical, we're really talking about enterprise-wide. It's going to impact the business at such a degree. Now, that's not to say that you couldn't have a small business unit or something that has one product or service that will basically, monkey up the works if it doesn't work. But generally speaking, we are thinking about the organization as a whole. We're thinking about all of our customers, or any of our customers, rather. That's the appropriate way to say it, versus how it's going to impact just one area of the business. I hope that helps.
Wonderful. Next question. Should you consider spend when identifying critical vendors?
Yeah, you absolutely can consider spend. I mean, obviously, when you're spending a lot of money on something, it's a product or service that you're using a lot of, or it's very important, right? So kind of the higher the cost, the higher the value in theory. So yeah, it definitely can be a consideration, especially if you spend a lot of money to implement that vendor, right? You add a bunch of extra budget or project dollars to get that up and running. I absolutely would consider it.
Great. I think we have time for one more question.
Mm-hmm.
Are offshore vendors considered critical?
Offshore vendors?
Yes.
Offshore vendors are not necessarily considered critical, but all offshore vendors do need very thorough due diligence. Most offshore, just by nature of being offshore, are going to fall in that high risk category. Now, let's say you have an offshore vendor that is providing a call center. That's a very common use of offshore companies. That would be a critical vendor because they're interacting directly with your customer. So being offshore in and of itself usually generates a higher risk rating. Its criticality depends on that product or service and how much it's going to impact your business or your customer.
Great. Thanks, Hillary. Unfortunately, that is all the time we have left for questions today. Thank you again, Hillary, for taking the time to address some of those that came in. Any questions we did not have time to answer today, we will address with you offline. We'd like to thank you all for attending and hope you found today's session valuable. A big thank you to Hillary for her time and great content. You can ask even more questions inside of our third-party think tank, an online community that is dedicated to third-party risk professionals and free to join. Just because today's session has ended doesn't mean the conversations and questions must. Post your questions at thirdpartythinktank.com and see what your peers have to say. In this community, you'll find thousands of free educational resources related to third-party risk management topics, such as vendor criticality and risk. If you'd like to become a member of Third Party Think Tank, you can register on the site or shoot us an email and we'll get you registered and send you a link to set your password. We did record today's session, and that recording link will be provided to you in a follow-up email that you will receive tomorrow afternoon. Also within that follow-up email will be the survey link for you to request a CPE credit. On behalf of Inminder, it has been a pleasure. Thank you and have a great rest of your day.